In this episode, I talk about the emergency fund, whether or not to pay off high interest debt with low interest debt, and how you can make an unpredictable income predictable.
I go beyond the philosophy, and I give you real life application. I am Coach Nino Villa.
Hey everybody, and welcome to episode number 7 of the Ask Coach Nino Villa show. I just want to start this episode off by saying thank you. I want to thank each and every one of you who are viewing these videos week after week. I want to thank those who are commenting, and most especially I want to thank those who are asking questions. All of the comments and the questions that are coming in just kind of validates the reason why I do this and why I'm so excited to be able to answer your questions and help you out with your specific situations. So without further ado, let's get to this week's questions.
First question. Your thoughts on what a true emergency is that justifies dipping into the emergency fund? Thanks.
This is another great question about what constitutes an emergency and what doesn't. And the bottom line is you have to ask yourself, how are you defining the word emergency? So an emergency should really be some unforeseen expense. It's just something that you didn't even know was coming up versus something that you kind of know you might have to take care of eventually, but you're just putting it off. And, when you finally need to take care of it, all of a sudden it's an emergency. So let me give you an example. Imagine you're driving down the road and heaven forbid your tire blows out. Well, you now need to go get that tire repaired, and maybe you even find that you need to replace the other 3 tires. Well, that was kind of unforeseen. You didn't know that you were going to blow out the one tire, and maybe you didn't know the other tires were bad. So that's an emergency. And so now we would use the emergency fund to replace those tires. But if you know your tires are getting bad, and you know that they need to be replaced, and you are just not moving on that, well, that's not necessarily an emergency. I mean, if something does happen, it becomes an emergency, but you should be, because that is a foreseen expense, you should be saving up so that you can replace the tires or make the strategic decision that you're going to replace those tires using the emergency fund, and then the very first thing you're going to do is replenish the emergency fund. And that's an important part of this whole equation, right? First, you have to define for yourself what an emergency is. And again, that really should be an unforeseen expense. Another way you can identify an emergency from a non-emergency is ask yourself, is this a need or is it a want? So I may need to replace the tires because I need to get to work. That's an emergency. But let's say your microwave goes out. Okay, microwave is a convenience thing. There's other ways that you can heat up food, you can throw it in the oven or whatever. And so replacing the microwave, although it might be a want and it might be a highly desired want, it's not yet a need, and therefore it's not an emergency. So instead, save up to replace the microwave. Don't use the emergency fund to replace the microwave, but do use the emergency fund to replace the tires. So that's the first part of it. The first part is defining for yourself what an emergency is and really understanding that there are very, very few emergencies really, and that there are other things that are just inconvenient, but those inconveniences aren't emergencies. The next part of the emergency fund is knowing that if you use it, so let's say you do replace those tires, it costs you $400 to replace tires. You now need to replace that $400 into the emergency fund before you do anything else in the way of paying off debt. So if you're in baby step 2 of Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover and you are paying off debt, if you use the emergency fund for something, you want to now pause on making any aggressive debt payments. Of course, you would still pay your minimums, and instead you would replenish the emergency fund. The emergency fund essentially becomes your own personal kind of $1,000 credit card, if you will. When you need to use it, you dip into it, you use the emergency fund, but then it becomes the very first priority to replenish it once you do use it. And that's why you also don't want to label everything an emergency. You don't want to be using the emergency fund month after month after month after month, only to have to replenish it. That's called poor planning. That's called not foreseeing your expenses and not budgeting properly. So if you're using the emergency fund month after month after month, it is more likely that you are not planning properly in your budget and less likely that you're truly having emergencies. So I hope that helps.
Shoneen asks, I was thinking about using my student loans to pay off debt with a higher interest rate than the student loan. What are your thoughts?
Shoneen, red flag, red flag, red flag. I know you have the best of intentions, and mathematically what you're saying makes sense, but there are so many pitfalls, there are traps. There are traps in thinking that you're going to use your student loan money to pay off other loans because the student loan has a smaller interest rate than the other loans. A couple of things here. One, the road to destruction is paved with good intentions. You have good intentions. You're trying to save yourself on the interest, etc., etc. But speaking from experience, you won't do it. Or you will, but then you'll use other money from student loans for something else, and you're going to make a mess of things. Don't do it. Don't do it. Just embrace the discipline and a little bit of the pain that comes with having to pay those higher interest rates now to get out of debt, because as Arnold famously said one time, no pain, no gain, right? And if you don't feel the pain of some of your poor decisions up to this point, as you're trying to work your way out of it, you're not going to gain the wisdom and the discipline and the discernment needed to stay away from those bad decisions next time. So that's the first red flag. Don't do it because you have good intentions. However, your good intentions will lead to bad choices later. The second reason I would advise you not to do this is because you're going to feel a sense of accomplishment, like you did something. And the fact of the matter is that you cannot borrow your way out of debt, right? By moving debt around and playing the shell game, you haven't really done anything except maybe change the math a little bit on the interest rate. But that money, you still owe that money. You now just owe it to a different lender. And so it's the same thing when you consolidate debt and you get a debt consolidation loan and you feel like, oh, at least I paid off these 5 other credit lines and now I only have this one. You feel a sense of accomplishment. Oh, I did something. But the problem is that the debt still remains. The debt didn't go anywhere. You just moved it. And so don't fall into these two traps. The trap of feeling like you did something and you feel a sense of accomplishment, and so then maybe you lose momentum because you feel like you did something. And don't fall into the trap of thinking, okay, I can out-math this problem by paying off a higher interest loan with a lower interest loan, and that's my student loans, and so I'm going to get the money back from the school and I'll pay the debt, but then I'm going to hold on to this other portion of it and do something else with it, because you're just going to find yourself in a larger amount of debt with a smaller interest rate, and you don't want to do that. So I know you have good intentions. I know you're thinking intelligently about the math side of it, the interest rate, but I'm begging you, don't do it, because the road of destruction is paved with great intentions, and you have good intentions. And yes, the math is in your favor, but human behavior is not. And so I would strongly advise against using any of your student loans to pay off other loans. Instead, just don't take that money from the government. Keep it at bay so that you don't accumulate more debt. So I'm with you on the math side. I'm not with you on the behavior side. I hope that helps.
Nick asks, I am starting to record my total earnings each shift, but what would you do for the section indicated as pay date in your template?
Hey Nick, thanks for the question. And this is a question that I answered just a couple of episodes ago, but I wanted to answer it again because, one, it is such a common question. I get it all the time. I have an irregular income. My hours fluctuate. I work on tips. I work for commission. How do I budget? It's so very common. I also wanted to answer it again because I'm hoping that this time I can be a little bit more succinct in my answer so that it is clear how anyone that has fluctuating hours anyone who works for tips or works on commission, how they themselves can budget. And so there's a couple of steps here. The first step, I want you to determine what your monthly expenses are. So the example I gave before is monthly expenses equal $4,000. Okay, they never exceed $4,000. So there's where you start. Step number one, determine what your monthly expenses are. The second thing I want you to do is I want you to determine your average earnings. So whether you're averaging it out over a week or whether you're averaging it out over a month, you want to keep it to whatever pay periods you're used to. So if you're used to getting a check every week, figure out what your average earnings are in a week. If you're used to being paid bi-weekly, figure out what your average earnings are bi-weekly and monthly and so on. And so if you're somebody who works for tips daily, I still want you to look at a week. What is your average earnings in a week? And so the example that I gave was the average earnings in a month truly did fluctuate, but they averaged around $8,000 a month. And so it could be as low as $2,000, it could be as high as $15,000, but $8,000 a month was about average. So that second step is to really determine what your average income is in a pay period. Once you have that average, the third thing I want you to do is I want you to put yourself on a salary. Okay, so in the example, the expenses don't exceed $4,000. The average income is $8,000, but based on the expenses, the salary becomes $1,000 per week. So I want you to put yourself on a salary so that you have a predictable income. And so whether you're doing that weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, that doesn't matter as much as putting yourself on a system where you know that every week or every 2 weeks or every month, this is exactly how much my income is. So determine what your expenses are monthly, determine what your average income is for a pay period, and then put yourself on a salary based on the expenses. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to save every single dollar you earn over your salary into a savings account. This is going to become the fund in which will help you when you have a bad week, a bad month, whatever the case may be, and it's going to be the money that you can bonus yourself out from in a later step. But think about this. You know what your expenses are, $4,000 a month. You know what your average income is. It's about $8,000, but you're only going to put yourself on a salary for $4,000 to cover your expenses. So anything you're making over that, you're just putting into a savings account so that you can pay yourself from that account later when you have a bad pay period, or to bonus yourself later when some money has really accumulated to help you accomplish other financial goals. So those become like the fifth and sixth steps of this method. So the fifth step being pay yourself from the savings account anytime you have a bad pay period. So if we go back to the example of paying ourselves a salary of $1,000 per week, let's say we have a week where we only make $800. Where are we going to get the other $200 from? That $200 is going to come in from the savings account so that we can continue to pay ourselves a predictable salary every pay period. And then that sixth step is bonus yourself every 3, 6, or 12 months. Give yourself a bonus out of that savings account as that money continues to grow so that it can help you to achieve other financial goals. So let's go back to the example. The example is there's a $4,000 income predictable every single month. But let's say we're generating $10,000 worth of income every month. So now we have this $6,000 that we're just socking away into the savings account. And we do that month after month. And let's say after 6 months, we look at that account and we have $36,000 in that account. Well, now we can bonus some of that money out. So we can take a look at that account. We can kind of look at our financial goals. Let's say we have a couple of credit cards and maybe even an auto loan we want to pay off. Well, you start to look at all the debts. You look at how much money you have in that account, and you can give yourself a bonus at the 3-month mark, at the 6-month mark, at the 12-month mark, and that way you can achieve those financial goals of paying off debt or whatever the case may be. But you're just going to go about it a little bit differently. Now that's a pretty extreme example. So if we brought some of those numbers down, let's say we gave an example of $2,000 worth of income throughout the month. So maybe you make $500 in tips every single week. All right, and that's really predictable. And in some of your good weeks, maybe you're up around $800, and maybe in a bad week you only make $300. And so all the same principles apply. You're gonna put yourself on a $500 weekly salary, and so when you have really good weeks and you make more than $500, you're gonna put that money into savings, so that when you have a bad week where maybe you only make $300, you can take $200 out of the savings to pay yourself that $500 a week consistently, very predictably. Because having a predictable income, for me, is key to having a successful budget. Having an income that fluctuates each and every week just makes it even more difficult to budget. So here's a very logical and practical way to get yourself on a consistent, predictable income. So that does it for episode number 7 of the Ask Coach Nino Villa show. Continue to submit your questions so that I can answer them on future episodes.